levels of oppression or the levels of discrimination you face compound, they increase. And that increase was originally not reflected in terms of theory, right? So originally theories were very diverse and put into different boxes. So you had queer theory, which was all about LGBTQIA rights. You had a lot of anti-caste theorists who wrote a lot about caste and how caste oppression works. And you had a lot of feminist theory, which worked on, the assumption that gender by itself can lead to discrimination. All three of these were divided into neat, clear boxes, but real life, unfortunately, did not work in those neat, clear boxes, which is why intersectionality developed. It developed because human beings don't fall into clear boxes, even though on paper it seems like they do, right? Um, Now, a lot of the discussion that we will have today might seem a little theoretical or might seem like it's all in the air, but I'll try to keep it as non-theoretical as I can. Um, so now that we know what intersectionality is and how it works, we can probably move ahead. I will just mm, share this if it works. There seems to be some issue in terms of like sharing this thing. Um, one second. Can you all see it? Because it isn't sharing for me.
It is invisible.
It isn't visible. Just give me a minute then. Mm. Okay, why don't we just sort of start without it? Then it's fine. Um, so yes, now that we know what intersectionality is, I wanted to talk a little bit about two terms which are quite important in terms of both the LGBTQIA plus movement and the disability rights movement, and two terms which sort of unite the both of them. And that is language. Language really unites both of these movements together because our initial fights always begin from language, right? Because there's so much heteronormativity within our language itself. Our language is based on assumptions about sexuality, about gender, about able-bodiedness, right? Which is why a lot of our initial, which is why we start from language in this section as well. Um, so in terms of both disabled folks as well as queer folks, initially there was a lot of within the movements itself, there was a lot of debate about whether certain terms are correct terms or incorrect terms to be used, right? Um, for instance, within the queer movement today as well, there are terms which are contested. There are a lot of terms which are reclaimed. There are terms which were originally considered bad, but now they're considered to be good. They're terms that people accept, and because In fact, the term queer itself was a term which was originally considered to be not a good term, a term that was used to demean people belonging to the community, but now it has been reclaimed, right? So, very similarly to that, within the disability rights movement, also, the term that we use is the term crip, right? So, the term crip was originally used to sort of show a reduced ability or to show disability of some kind in a very negative sense, to use it as, in the sense of someone not having something or someone having some limitation. So now this term has also been reclaimed. So that's number one, a big similarity between these two movements. The fact that both of them are based on reclaiming language. Another big similarity between these movements is that both of them, mm, mm, yeah, is that both of them, like I mentioned, while they challenge language, they also challenge compulsory structures in society. Now, our society is, of course, based on structures that are considered to be normal, that are considered to be normal in whatever sense one might think of things as normal. But so you have a concept called heteronormativity. How many of you know of the concept heteronormativity? Does anyone want to talk about that concept a little bit? If you don't, that's also fine. I'm not gonna
Someone raised her hand. I think she can go ahead.
Right. So, at least my perception of heteronormativity is that individuals are supposed to be cishet individuals. You're supposed to be cisgendered. Heteronormativity is that at least sexual relations between a man and women are considered normal. Everything else is against perhaps the understanding of nature, or is against the principles of like nature or science and things like that. And so the status quo that is normal is a relationship between a man and a woman, and everything else is abnormal at least.
Yeah, correct. That's absolutely right. And I mean, so that is a concept that a lot of queer rights scholars write against, because of course, who even came up with this concept of normal and not normal? Who even decided what was okay and what was not okay? There was no, there is no one making a decision on other people's personal lives, correct? So that is where the queer rights movement really challenges heteronormativity. Similar to that, the disability rights movement challenges able-bodiedness. Now, able-bodiedness is just like heteronormativity is a societal assumption that everyone will be cis, that men and women will enter into relationships with each other. These relationships will be sexual, will be focused on reproduction. Now, all of that forms a part of heteronormativity. Similar to that, able-bodiedness is the assumption that everyone in society will have some abilities, will be a person of a certain amount of ability. And if they are not a person of that ability, then they are not a part of society, right? So it is that assumption that the disability rights movement challenges. So very similar to the queer rights movement, we are also at the crux of it challenging an assumption. We're challenging the fact that everyone is not able-bodied. Everyone is not a person who doesn't have a disability. There are disabled people who are out there and who want to make their voice heard. Just like queer people who are out there also wanted to make their voice heard and do make their voice heard, right? Now, what happens in the situation of when you merge both of these oppressions together? Because when you have someone who identifies as queer as well as disabled, they go through both of these kind of assumptions in everyday life. They go through both heteronormativity as well as able-bodiedness as assumptions. And both of these assumptions, when they come together, they compound the oppression that a person faces, which is why we need sort of an intersectional approach, because we need to realize that both able-bodiedness and heteronormativity can sort of go on top of each other, can go together, and do go together in society on a day-to-day basis. Now let's come to another sort of thing. How many of you read about the whole Britney Spears thing that happened a little while ago. The conservatorship thing that became very, very popular on social media. Everyone was talking about it. Did any of you read about it?
I think a few people have raised their hands. They can turn their mic on and speak.
Right. I think it was everywhere across our social media. It was something that was trending on Twitter. It was trending across like people at like award functions and stuff like that were wearing outfits that said Free Britney, and they were holding banners that said Free Britney. And yeah, I think it became very important because like Britney Spears is a very important part of like pop culture and like of our childhoods and stuff like that. And to like imagine that something so devastating had happened to someone so powerful and rich was I think shocking for most of us.
Correct. Yeah, and it stayed for quite long. I mean, it's still something that is being contested and debated and spoken about and written about in academic circles as well. So you have something like that that has taken place. That is a kind of institutionalization, right? When you have someone by force put into a kind of arrangement that they don't want to be in, that is institutionalization. And that is something that both the queer community as well as the disabled community go through regularly. When you, for queer communities, definitely institutionalization can look different. It can look like conversion camps, conversion therapy, which is, I mean, conversion camps are not as common in the Indian context, but conversion therapy is definitely quite common. So you have that form of institutionalization for queer folks. For disabled folks, that may look a little different. You have institutionalization in the form of just being confined to one's home, not being allowed to go out, being forced to be put under the guardianship of someone else, which is what happened in the Free Britney thing. So all of that can lead to a lot of institutionalization, which is also a common experience across both of these communities, right? So we've learned till now that there are certain common threads which go through and bind these movements together. You have the thread of language, because both of these movements are so focused on challenging the status quo that exists today in terms of both heteronormativity and able-bodiedness, that they have to challenge our initial language and the way we speak. For instance, the best example of this is how queer rights movements have led to a big change in academia also. Because earlier academia always reverted back to he. So when you did not know the gender of someone, you would refer to that person as he. But now there has been a shift in terms of so many writing guides, so many style guides in terms of reverting back to they instead of reverting back to he. So that by itself is something that's it looks like a very minor change, definitely. But it is a change that has happened because of the movement itself. Similarly, when you talk about the disability rights movement, a lot of what is being done in the disability rights movement also focuses on assumptions that people have. And in the Indian context, definitely much lesser is done. But now you have a lot of hiring organizations, a lot of firms who require you to fill out accommodation questionnaires, wherein wherein you mention if you have any special needs. Special needs is a very bad term, but you mention in case you have any needs which need to be fulfilled by the organization to help you work there. So that by itself is also a change in terms of moving away from the heteronormative structure as well as the able-bodied structure. And then in terms of institutionalization, there is a lot of work that's happening currently within the movement in terms of trying to break free from these institutions. The Free Britney movement was one example of this. But of course, there are so many more examples which are not as famous or not as spoken about. For instance, in the Indian context, there are so many examples of same-sex couples who are broken up by their families by way of filing a habeas corpus petition, right? If you read about it, you'll find that there are so many judgments that have been passed where courts have allowed habeas corpus just because a person is with their significant other, which makes absolutely no sense from a legal perspective also. But it has been allowed by lower courts. And now, of course, we're moving a little bit away from this with some progressive judgments, but there is still that idea of conservatorship, which is very, very strongly entrenched in our system even today. For disabled folks as well, the idea of conservatorship looks different in our system, but it does exist because some form of de facto conservatorship is created when there is no accessibility, when there is no way for you to go out and do things that you want to. You're forced to be confined to your home. For instance, for me, I use a wheelchair. So if I have to go somewhere, I need to be aware of the fact that that place has these many stairs, that place has this ramp. Is that ramp a real ramp? Because many ramps are not real ramps. They're ramps that you can't take your wheelchair. So you have to be cognizant of these facts. So that leads to, again, a form of institutionalization, which is not direct, but indirect, because a lot of institutions are allowed to exclude you. So indirectly, you are confined to certain number of places, certain number of institutions. I have 5 restaurants I can go to. I cannot try a new one. That can also be a problem, right? So there is that. And then there is also forced institutionalization in case of disabled folks. For instance, in the PWD Act, um, there is a very strange provision about persons who have high mobility support needs. These people are people who have extremely high support needs. They have disability percentages of 70 to 80%, right? So in case of these people, there is recently the railways came out with a circular stating that these people could travel with these other people. So they can't travel on their own, they need support, therefore they can travel with these other people. And the people mentioned there were really specific. So I could travel either with my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, not with my girlfriend or my boyfriend if I wanted to. I could only travel with these, close relatives or like my husband. There was no scope for anyone else. So that was a problem, and that is a problem that does exist because there is still that idea that you need to be constantly having a guardian looking after you, which can be extremely problematic, right? So now that we've spoken about how these movements do have some commonalities between them, it's also important to speak about if they have any shared history with each other. And before we move on to that, let's also speak about one other thing which I wanted to talk about, which is the fact that both of these movements have also been capitalized on heavily. Both of these movements have also been exploited heavily. Uh, has anyone here heard of the phrase rainbow capitalism? I can see nodding of heads. So can you tell us what it is?
So like certain brands, especially during Pride Month, would like just like stamp on a rainbow at like their t-shirts or merchandise or whatever they're selling. And they might not even believe in the cause, or they might actively support homophobic investors or something, but they just put on the rainbow thing just to sell their product. And yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And it is very anger inducing when they do that, especially when you know that there are organizations that are actively homophobic. So that sort of capitalization of an individual's identity has happened for both the disability rights movement and the queer rights movement. You will have noticed a lot of firms, a lot of I know of law firms because that's where I have done most of my research. But a lot of law firms, for instance, as well as a lot of IT companies, have started a lot of diversity and inclusion drives, right? You see all this about how certain hotels are employing people with disabilities to sit at their front desk. You hear about how these, some shopping chain has decided to only have cashiers who are deaf. So all of that, is that something that really helps the disability rights movement? is a question you have to ask, because do you see those people higher up in the organizational structure? Never, almost never. You see them at the bottom. That's where they are included. That's where they are put in, and that's where they're supposed to stay. There's nothing that really exists which allows them to rise in that organization. They are taught 3 tasks that, okay, all these people will come with their stuff. You just have to scan it, put it in the bag, and you're done. And that's what they're taught, and that's what they do, because that's all they're taught, and they're not considered to be people who can do more than that. And they're supposed to be happy with, having that. And that is publicized so heavily that you almost start thinking that, wow, this organization is such a savior. This organization is doing so much for these people. And that's a problematic thing, because that should just be the bare minimum that anyone does for people, right? So in this regard, there is a lot of literature, especially Foucault has written a lot about how individual identity is often capitalized on, and corporates use individual identity to further their own interests, right? So that is something that happens with both of these movements. And that's something that's such a huge part of neoliberalism, such a huge part of, the world that we see around us today, because so many aspects of our individual identity are capitalized and so many corporate structures use these parts of our identity that we feel a little like, okay, maybe this is how it's supposed to be. And that's probably what neoliberalism is, the only sort of structure that all of us know, at least, which is why we feel that, okay, that's fine, it's normal, it's okay. But it's actually quite dangerous when they do that. And they do that with both queer and disabled identities. Now that we've spoken a little bit about like the common threads which flow through both of these movements, it's also important to go to speaking about what, if they have any common shared history together, like I mentioned. So the first time these movements really became intertwined with each other was was actually not in the Indian context, but was mostly during the AIDS epidemic. And the AIDS epidemic mostly in the US. Now, when you had the AIDS epidemic coming about, you had a lot of gay men, particularly, becoming sick at one point of time and needing caretakers and needing help and needing assistance, more than usual assistance in terms of, their medical needs and stuff like that. And access to healthcare suddenly became a huge, huge agenda for the LGBTQIA plus community. It became a absolutely big and essential thing for them, which is why these movements sort of learned how to intertwine and work together. Because at the same time, you had a lot of gay men who survived the epidemic and were people who and suddenly found that they had limited abilities and therefore became part of the disability rights movement organically. There was a huge, huge bundle of people, therefore, who moved from one movement to another movement. And when both of these movements came together, at that time, the disability rights movement was not as strong in the US. The disability rights movement was, in fact, just at a very nascent stage. And the queer rights movement was actually quite strong at that time. And the queer rights movement had a lot of strategies that the disability rights movement started to use. One of the biggest strategies of the queer rights movement always has been public demonstration, has been going out on the streets and saying that we're out and we're proud and we're just going to flood the street with us because we exist. On the other hand, the disability rights movement did not really do this because of, again, accessibility issues, because of just organizational issues and stuff of that kind. But now that these movements sort of came together, there was scope for better organization. There was that experience of the queer rights movement that the disability rights movement could also use. Therefore, the disability rights movement started organizing a lot more sit-ins, a lot more just flooding the gates of Congress and just standing there in whatever way they could, just making themselves seen and heard. And this is also what led to a lot of changes in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that is one part of the history that they have together, which is in the American context, of course. In the context of UK and other countries as well, there is similar shared history because of the fact that these movements realized that they had to work together in order to achieve common goals. And they realized that they had a lot of overlap as well. They realized that a lot of people were both queer and disabled, and a lot of queer people found themselves also wanting to help out the disabled rights movement and the other way around, which is why these movements became sort of intertwined. But that intertwining has not really happened in the Indian context because of many reasons, starting with the fact that there exists no proper disability rights movement in the Indian context. In the Indian context, you see disability rights being spoken about as, just because there's Paralympics, suddenly there'll be 5 articles in the paper about disability rights, and that's it. And then something will happen someday, and everyone will be like, okay, fine, let's talk about it for some time, and then people will forget about it again, right? So you do not have a large scale movement. At the same time, you do not have any judicial pronouncements of as much significance as, let's say, Navdeep Singh Johar in the LGBTQI rights context, right? So you do not have any big pronouncements, nor do you have any, sort of big movement of people happening. And there are, of course, many different reasons for this. One major reason for this is the fact that there is limited accessibility to organizational tools, there is limited accessibility to, which prohibits people from actually coming together and speaking to each other about their disability. It also arises because of the fact that the Indian law only recognizes 21 disabilities as disabilities which can be certified. So if you have only 21 disabilities which can be certified, and to get a certificate, you have to fall in the above 40% bracket of these 21 disabilities, that creates an issue because you are narrowing down the scope of disabled folks in and by itself. And the Indian Act does this in a very sneaky way. They do this by first importing a definition of disability which is very wide. So they say that disability by itself is a very wide term, but we are only able to certify these 21 disabilities. So what happens then is that there is a lot of problem that people face in getting their disabilities certified in the first place, because there is very, very limited, there's very limited access to certifying centers also. You have to go to a government hospital where it takes about 2 days to get everything checked. There is a lot of subjectivity involved in the assessments that are done. There is no appeal mechanism for the assessments which are done. So once you're assessed. You can't really go back there and be like, okay, I want to appeal this, or I feel like there is still something wrong with me. And that creates more of an issue because you can't do anything once you're assessed. You're just stuck with that assessment forever. At the same time, the 21 disabilities which are listed out in the Act ignore a lot of illnesses which qualify as disabilities. So, for instance, there is no mention of illnesses which are autoimmune in nature. So, you might have debilitating arthritis, but you will not qualify to be disabled under the Act. You might have arthritis so bad that you're using a wheelchair all the time, you're still not disabled. Genetic illnesses. So, illnesses like, for instance, Down syndrome. Down syndrome is it seems like almost instantaneously you want to say that, okay, fine, I'm sure this qualifies to be a disability. But there have been so many certifications of Down syndrome patients where it has been found that they are not disabled, which seems to be absurd. Then And other genetic illnesses, there are a lot of genetic illnesses which are discovered on a day-to-day basis, which are not accounted for in the Act. And the Act is supposed to be amended every 2 years to increase the scope of disabilities that it includes. However, it has never been amended since it has been brought into force. It has only included those 21 disabilities over the last 5 years, and no change has occurred. At the same time, therefore, there are no people to really drive the movement forward, because the people who are covered in the Act are people who are usually in such terrible situations that they are unable to even come out of their houses, because, of course, you do not have the accessibility necessary to make them come out of their houses. So they are stuck in their houses. At the same time, other people are stuck at fighting for even getting recognition under the law, which is something that we do not get. For instance, with me as well, I have a genetic illness which is not covered under the PWD Act at all. So that's an illness that we had to make specific representations to the government, which took a long, long time to even get a response to. And then the response that we got was that this is something that has to be amended by the parliament and we can't really do anything about it. So that is a major issue in terms of, at least getting people on board. Then there are really specific issues that arise if you're both a part of the LGBTQIA community and disabled. One of these is dangers that can arise in your own home. Because if you are disabled, you cannot really immediately leave your house in the situation that you're living in an environment that is not safe. So if you, for instance, identify as trans and your parents don't support it, you don't even have the option of simply walking out of your house, given the fact that you will be dependent on your parents to some extent. So that leads to a lot of issues. At the same time, while this has not happened in the Indian context, there does exist sufficient jurisprudence to support that if a disabled person even leaves their house in such a situation, the parents can simply get them back, stating that they are people who need a guardian. So that by itself is something that is extremely worrying and startling, because even if you are an adult and you leave your house, ideally it should be fine. You should be allowed to just leave your house and do whatever you want. But owing to the fact that there exists these de facto conservatorships in the Indian context as well, there is a huge problem in terms of you doing that. Then another problem that arises is medical care. Now, when it comes to disabled folks and those folks who belong to the queer community, and if you're both of them, again, medical care becomes a major issue, because a lot of medical care is based on heteronormative standards. A lot of medical care is based on the standards that, you should not be taking any hormone therapy with these medications. What do you do in that situation? How do you talk to your doctors about the fact that you want to take hormone therapy with other existing medication? You cannot do that, because that's not something that is your right under law even today. You can't decide on your own what gender you want to be, because that's apparently something the state still has a say in. So that can lead to a lot of problems as well. Now, again, another big issue which arises is the lack of representation in the LGBTQIA movement itself when it comes to disabled folks. While there are a lot of LGBTQIA plus forums, because these are forums that are now okay under the act, which is under the law, which is why a lot of them can come up and a lot of them can do whatever they want. But there is still a huge accessibility issue in terms of even disabled folks even being called to the table, or even being made part of conversations about sexuality, or being made part of conversations about gender. These are still issues which sort of remain and can only be maybe tackled if there is some sort of reconciliation between these two movements. And that has worked well in other countries, because reconciliation has led to both movements being able to learn from each other. given the fact that we have these common enemies, given the fact that we both are fighting towards societal structures which are extremely, extremely rooted, and we're both trying to uproot these structures and create new identities, that can actually help a lot more um, in terms of, I don't know, achieving a lot of things, which is why now there have been some attempts to increase accessibility in pride related spaces. There have been some attempts to increase accessibility now that things are virtual, and there can be, more people coming together and doing something, even though they cannot physically be there. But there's still very limited access. For instance, if you look at the Delhi Pride, which is such a huge event, that event by itself is not a wheelchair accessible event. That event requires you to be able to walk, because you're walking on the street on one side, and there are footpaths which go up and down and up and down. And wheelchairs cannot go on those footpaths at all, which is why even if you stay here, you probably can never go to that Pride parade ever. So that is a huge, huge problem that occurs. And of course, resolving it at that level is one thing. Resolving it at the level of, organization and making people come together is one thing. But at a policy level, there are a lot of changes which are required in both the disability laws as well as in terms of the current queer rights laws as well. One thing I want to show if it works. Let me check. Mm. Right. So I also want to talk a little bit about um, a little bit about the non-discrimination law. This is something that has been spoken about in both queer rights spaces and disability rights spaces in India in the recent context, because while there is a proper law that exists, which in terms of the Navdeep Singh Johar decision, which says that you cannot be discriminated against, there is no legislative provision which sort of says that, is particularly with regard to sexuality. With regard to gender, maybe you can push Article 15 to that extent, but it doesn't use the term sexuality anyway. So there has some talk of creating some sort of non-discrimination law which combines the concerns of both these movements together. That is one thing. Let me see if there's anything else I missed that I can speak about. Right. So, yeah, one thing that I did not speak about was, and I can probably just cover it up in the last 5 minutes, and then we can open it up in case there are any questions. So one thing I did not cover was the idea of being both crip and queer. So, like I mentioned, both of these terms are terms that were originally used as bad terms, technically. They were terms which were called that, which were used to insult people who belonged to these communities. However, they have been reclaimed at this point. But this form of activism has also been criticized. A form of activism that relies on these terminologies and focuses on, showing everyone that you're crip and you're queer. That has been criticized often as being just edgy activism, which doesn't really achieve anything. But that's something that I personally do not really agree with, given the fact that most of the times language is where a lot of our problems start, and reclaiming language can be a huge part of resolving these problems also. So yeah, and I mean, there has been a lot of talk also about how these movements can be combined from a theoretical standpoint, given the fact that both of these rely on, like I said, common enemies. So in theory, there is a particular book that's written by Robert, name in the chat in case someone is interested in checking it out. A lot of what I spoke of today are ideas from that book itself. Yeah. It's very, very easily available on sites which I will not mention now, but you can find it easily online. It'll be fine. So you can look at this because it speaks about ways in which practically these movements can be combined. Practically these movements can sort of help each other. Of course, there's a lot that both of these movements can offer to each other. And there's a lot of particular needs that disabled folks have being a part of the queer community, like I mentioned. So yeah, I think that sort of brings me to the end of all the talking I wanted to do. So in case there are any questions or anything you'd like to know, you can always ask or you can put it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. We can wait probably for 2-3 minutes for that.
Okay, hi. If I may say something.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for that. Presentation was really good, like whatever you spoke about, very enlightening. So I wanted to ask, as students, is there something that we can do about it? Because there's not a lot of discourse, as you yourself mentioned, that there's not a lot of discourse that's happening on this area, on this topic. So is there any thing that we can do as law students? Is there any channel through which we can express our support, our views, our beliefs, in any manner to increase the discourse, to let more and more people know about the cause?
Yeah, so I think that one very important thing is to sort of try to write about it because that is one thing that really helps. Given the fact that not a lot of even these topics don't even make it to news, right? These topics don't even make it to like any mainstream channels or anything at all. You do not find people discussing how these movements can be combined anywhere. So if you write about that, that will be very helpful. You can also look at so for instance, like I mentioned, we have a base of about 50-55 people who work regularly on these issues, and we work regularly on trying to not just put out content, but also with working now on a lot of policy changes as well. So if you want to, of course, join us at any point of time and help out in that way, also you can do that. I'll put my number also in the chat in case any of you want to sort of join and help out. You can do it that way also because we're also still figuring it out because there's very, very limited amount of work that has been done in this context, which is why there's a lot to be done. There's a lot of policy changes that need to be affected to actually result in some change. But right now, we're at the stage of still identifying these policies that need to be changed. We're still at the stage of looking at policies which could have implications for disabled queer folks. And one of those policies, like I mentioned, was the policy regarding railway travel that I mentioned today. And there are other policies like that also. For instance, there's a policy regarding there are these government orders, right, that are issued when people are being transferred from one government department to another. And there are usually exceptions which are put in place for disabled folks because it's sort of recognized that that might be a little difficult to just move base regularly. Those exceptions are also put in place only for disabled folks of who have about 5 to 6 disabilities, not more than that. So in case you have a disability, which can of course get triggered if you're traveling or you're being forced to shift your job, the government really doesn't care as long as you don't if you don't fall in those 6 categories that they are mentioned in the circular, they can do whatever they want with you. At the same time, those 6 categories also have certain people who can stay with them in case they need help. These people are also people who are only family members. They cannot be people you're in a relationship with. They cannot be people of the same sex that you're in a relationship with. They are just mother, father, sister, brother, husband, wife. So that's also a sort of big issue. So we're working on this identification still at this stage. So if you want to join us, you're welcome.
Right, thank you.
If anyone else has a question,
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So in school, we're taught English grammar, right? So we're also taught about euphemisms, and we're told that instead of using the term disabled, use differently abled, and instead of using blind, use visually challenged. But then recently, when I interned in a disability rights NGO, I was told that no, you're not supposed to use the term differently abled because we want to be better allies. So do you think that this concept of euphemism, at least in this arena, has become sort of outdated, or like it shouldn't be taught in schools anymore?
So there's a lot of debate internally in the disability rights community about what is right and what is wrong in terms of how people should be addressed, right? So there are two different kinds of language that one can use in the disability rights community. There's a person first language and there's identity first language. So when you talk about person first language, that would mean saying person with disability. When I talk about identity first language, that would mean saying disabled person. Now, in that, a lot of disabled folks have preferences. Some people like person first language, some people like identity first language. When it comes to what you said about differently abled, the reason why that is being strongly opposed these days, and we as a sort of organization also don't really agree with the terminology differently abled, is because why should I have a different ability to compensate for an ability which I do not have? If I don't have a certain ability, we can just be upfront about it that, okay, fine, I am disabled, and that's okay. But saying differently abled carries with it that connotation that, there will be something that I will have magically to compensate for this. For instance, a lot of the times, if you remember, there was I don't know if any of you have heard it, but there's this conception about people who are visually impaired or blind that they have stronger other senses, right? It's a really strange conception that exists, but it's also a conception that's a little messed up because why should they have strong other senses? Why should that be a necessity for being the way we are, right? So that's why a lot of the times this term is no longer preferred by people. Also, but of course, a lot of government circulars still use the term specially abled, still use the same terminology, even though it's been discarded by the community itself. So, yeah, I mean, personally, I'm completely against the term specially abled unless someone really wants that term to be used for them, in which case, of course, it should depend on what the person wants to be called. But otherwise, it's usually a choice between identity first or person first language these days. And that's probably what we should shift to in terms of everything else also. I mean, the government in our country prefers a person first language, which is why everything is person with disability, person with disability. But most people in the disability rights movement prefer the identity first language, which is why you have people saying that I identify as an autistic person, saying that I identify as a disabled person. Very similar to how people say that I'm queer and proud. So it's similar to that.
Yeah,
If
thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so I have a very basic question. As an able-bodied person, as a cishet individual, when I write about these problems, is it in the sense that I'm almost taking up spaces of people who should be writing about it instead? And instead of like me writing about it, if I have a platform provided to perhaps someone else who has a better idea about it or who whose space is who it actually belongs to. So should people who are able-bodied, should people who are cishet individuals explore this area in the sense that write about it, or should they leave the opportunities for people who actually understand the issue in a more fundamental sense?
So there are two very different aspects to this, right? One aspect is writing about your personal experiences, or writing about like anything which you will only know if you have experience. For instance, writing about discrimination as a disabled person, or writing about ableism as a disabled person. That is something that definitely should be left up to disabled folks, because that is something that they can express better because they've gone through those things, right? An able-bodied person will not have the lived experience necessary for that. But what an able-bodied person can do is write about things from a policy perspective as well as write about them from a theoretical perspective, because that is something that still remains open to you, and that is something that can be done with inputs from disabled folks. And that much doing that does not amount to taking up space, in my opinion, because if you are doing it appropriately with the necessary inputs, that's fine. I mean, to be very frank, the government made an entire disability law without having one disabled person on the committee that they appointed to make it. So they're the ones taking up space, technically speaking. But yeah, so I think as long as you put in inputs of other people, as long as you don't write about lived experience, that's fine. If you just write a critique of the act from a legal perspective, that's not taking up space.
Right, thank you so much.
No problem.
If anyone else has any questions, you can put in the chat box or directly turn on your mic and ask.
I think just one thing that I did not cover, which is probably very basic, but I'll still mention, while if there are any questions, you can, of course, let us know in the meanwhile. Is that I didn't really cover the concepts of ableism and internalized ableism. So let me just tell you what they are in about 2 minutes time. So ableism is technically the idea that everyone is able-bodied, everyone has similar ability, everyone has, no one has a disability in simple terms. So that means that in case I am working in an organization and I get some work, and the person I'm working for knows that I am disabled, and I tell them that, hey, I cannot do this because my hand is hurting today, I am not able to type today. And they still continue to sort of give me that sort of work, even though I have communicated to them that I have this limited ability. That is ableist, given the fact that then they assume that I will have the same ability as everyone else, which is not true, right? So that is basically what ableism means. And internalized ableism is a little bit more complex, but it's the idea that most disabled folks live with a lot of guilt and shame, given the fact that they do not have what able-bodied folks have, right? Sometimes we try to push ourselves to limits that, or try to be able-bodied just so that we can fit into society. So that would mean that in the same situation, in case I'm working somewhere, someone gives me something to type, I have a lot of pain in my hand, I cannot type it, but I still go ahead and I'm like, I have to do it because they have given it to me. I must fulfill this responsibility, and I do not communicate to them, then that's sort of my internalized ableism, because I believe that I have to be able-bodied in order to fit into society. That's a little bit like passing for queer folks, because a little bit similar, not exactly the same, but just how queer folks also sometimes pass as being cishet folks, because it leads to, it's okay to, society accepts you a little bit better when you do that. That's a little bit like able-bodied, that's a little bit like disabled folks trying to be able-bodied just to fit in. So those concepts are also a little bit related. I thought I'd just add that in because I forgot that part. Yeah, so in case there are any questions, I don't think there are any.
Okay, so I think we can wrap up the session now.
Yeah.
I would like to request Ms. Preeti Badola, the faculty member of Legal Aid and Awareness Committee, to give the vote of thanks.
Hi. Yes, Himanshi. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Smita. That was wonderful lecture and a presentation. And I'll be very honest with you that this COVID-19 has given us so many opportunities to attend different webinars. And after a very long time, I have enjoyed one webinar thoroughly from the starting till the end. Thank you so much for explaining such heavy and important ideas in a very calming and simple manner to our students, because as a student of gender, I do understand that when any heavy term comes, it becomes very difficult to understand it and digest it and keep your temper in control, and I'm not one of those. I become very hyper, but hats off to you for explaining it in such a wonderful manner. You have pointed out in different directions how not only to look into the direct discrimination that the both of the communities are facing at this very moment of time, but at the same time, I think you are also pointing towards what Dr. Tarunab Khaitan is also urging us to do, that we are not supposed to, okay, fine, whatever visible is discriminatory, and that is very easily we can very easily identify it and then work towards it. But for the full realization of one's civil and social rights, we have to actually dwell into that concept and peel the layers of our laws and policies, and then point out towards the hidden discrimination that actually one community is facing. And when we are talking about the experiences, when we are talking about that what is wrong with a simple looking law, then we have to actually look from the perspective of the receiving end, and there comes the role of the lived experiences, and then not to try to be their what do I say, be their protectors and self-appointed protectors, that we many a times we appoint ourselves and that we say no, this is our role. Not to do that, but stand with them, hear, listen to them, hear to their lived experiences, and then do our bit where we can understand the policies and voice towards them. Thank you so much for doing that, Smita, and I'm looking forward to work with you in any way that I can. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you everyone for joining this session. Thank you, Preeti ma'am. Thank you, Samidha ma'am. I think we can wrap up the session now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you.